Jim Gooch was born and raised in Kentucky on a 200-year-old family farm, an experience that profoundly shaped his view of life and our place in the natural world. Growing up on a farm helped shape him as a pragmatic and problem-solving person, as well as one who was deeply concerned with generativity and cared deeply about other living things. He studied math and physics in college, and then at medical school he pursued a psychiatric specialty in children. He began analytic training while in the Navy, where he set up and administered a community clinic serving a military population in Long Beach of over 500,000 personnel and their family. He underwent a first 8-year training analysis with a traditional Freudian ego psychologist at the Southern California Psychoanalytic Institute, where he first became interested in the work of the British object relations analysts, despite the animosity at that time to that school in American psychoanalysis, which demonstrated his independent mind. Following a profoundly meaningful course with Albert Mason, who had recently come to Southern California to teach the work of Melanie Klein to a group of interested analysts at LAPSI, the original institute in LA founded by Otto Fenichel, Jim began a second analysis in September 1971 with Bion, which lasted 5 years, 5 times weekly. During this time, Jim co-created in consultation with Don Meltzer and Mattie Harris a psychoanalytic psychotherapy training program at Rice Davis Children's Clinic, modeled on the Tavistock. He served as assistant medical director and then as chief psychoanalyst at Rice Davis from 1977 to 2004. Having struggled with the restrictions on Kleinian and Bionian training within the American Psychoanalytic Association, in 1981, Jim joined a group of faculty members to form the Department of Psychoanalysis at the California Graduate Institute, which in 1984, at Jim's initiative, became the Psychoanalytic Center of California, a freestanding IPA institute dedicated to the work of Klein, Bion, and Winnicott. He served as the first president of PCC from 1984 to 1990. During this time, Jim served as the unofficial reader for the American editors of the IJP for all articles submitted on Bion and many on Klein. Jim was a founding member of the board of the Confederation of Independent Psychoanalytic Societies, SIPS, which challenged the hegemony of the American Psychoanalytic Association over psychoanalytic training in North America. Jim also served 8 years as a North American representative of the IPA board. He was one of the founding board members of the Francis Tustin Society. Although Jim wrote several important papers on Bion's technique based on his own analytic experience and his deep and profound knowledge of Bion's work, Jim's legacy to psychoanalysis was his generativity as an analyst, a supervisor, a mentor, a father, a grandfather, a founder of numerous analytic training courses and programs throughout California and indeed the nation. One of Jim's lasting contributions to psychoanalysis was on the need to find the balance between one's paternal discipline and one's maternal compassion. Too much of the former results in sadism, too much of the latter, masochism in relation to one's patients. Jim lived this fundamental truth and incarnated Bion's ideas about the importance of combining sense, myth, and passion, as anyone who knew him can recognize. Jim was essential to the spread of Bionian thinking in North America, particularly during the 70s through the 90s, when object relations was anathema to American psychoanalysis. For those of us who were fortunate enough to know and to work with Jim, we felt his passionate connection to his patients, to psychoanalysis, and to the communication of the experience of his analysis with and ongoing understanding of Bion. Listening to Jim describe his analysis with Bion gave one a visceral experience of how Bion must have worked at this time and at the end of his analytic practice. Perhaps the best way of appreciating the gift Jim left us with is to hear in his own words his description of some moments and some insights from his experience of analysis with Bion. Bion, both in person and in his writings, was very sensitive to and thoughtful about practical psychoanalytic epistemology, ephemeralness, evanescence, unknown sense organs of psychic qualities, problems regarding psychic common sense, multiple vertices equivalent to an upgraded depressive position, and correlation and communication. Having been with Bion reminds me of what it was like as a growing boy with my paternal grandfather and his sensitivity and thoughtfulness about the sensual experiences of nature as I encountered them in exquisite detail in his presence on his beloved farm in Kentucky. He would call to my attention the sounds and sights, odors, tastes, textures, temperatures, weights of everything we came across, comparing, contrasting, marveling with heartfelt wonder, reverence, awe, and humor. Our intimate encounters with nature led me to explorations on my own and attempts to share them with anyone who seemed interested. And so it was with Bion in the realm of psyche and related soma during our psychoanalytic sessions together, and when I read him to this day. I had 8 years of training analysis in the 60s with a respectful, humane, non-vain American analyst. I had benefited from it and was not harmed by it, which tragically cannot be said for many of my compatriots. However, I remained dissatisfied in my practice of analysis with adults, adolescents, and children, to the extent that I was thinking of giving it up and returning to the practice of medicine, which I had enjoyed very much as a student and intern, and briefly in practice with an HMO. I felt I was somehow not able to fully use my total experience as an analyst. I did not know how to utilize my own emotional and physical awareness when in session, nor after reflection on sessions or discussing them with colleagues. When I took my observations to supervisors and peers during my training, these experiences were attributed to countertransference that needed to be taken up in my own analysis, and by implication, they were regarded as interferences in the analyses I was conducted. I recognized that such emotional and physical experiences needed to be addressed in my own analysis, but I also felt intuitively that they could be useful somehow in my work as an analyst, if I could only discover how. Other supervisors and colleagues were struggling with similar intuitions, but were as much at a loss as I as to how to utilize their emotional and physical awarenesses with and about their analysands. I went into analysis with Bion because I'd found a very brief stint, 7 sessions, of Kleinian supervision with Albert Mason helpful, including the exploration of my own emotional experience with the analysand. There seemed to be some possibility of a kind of practice of analysis where I could be more integrally grounded in my own total emotional and physical experience in the moments with my analysands, as I had been with my patients in the practice of medicine. Perhaps I would not have to abandon 10 years of dedicated work, training, and tens of thousands of dollars and its emotional counterpart in a futile investment. Analysis with Bion was very different, notwithstanding some features which were in common with my first analysis. Again, there were many interpretations about my omnipotence, but this time there was a remarkable difference. Without exception, Bion would guess, his word, what the omnipotence was a defense against, always calling my attention to the evidence in the session that supported his conjecture. When no evidence was available to him, he would say something like, "My experience is that whenever a person uses omnipotence, they are feeling helpless about something. Omnipotence seems to be a psychic reflex for surviving actual helplessness, as in infancy, senility, and extreme physical illness. But if used at any other time, it produces helplessness, since it is an illusion. Perhaps you have some idea of what may be making you feel helpless so that you are reduced to omnipotence." Invariably, I would be able to identify that about which I was feeling helpless. Bion would also sometimes suggest guesses based on hunches, as he called them, where I am confident he was drawing evidence from his own emotional experience. I felt Bion was with me. The loneliness was much less intense. In time, I could feel and hear his emotionality as he interpreted, i.e. guessed, what I might be struggling to find access to and feel in the moment. I would say that even though he rarely told me directly of his own emotional experience, I was likely to know a great deal about him based on what he was and was not able to understand of me. Another feature of Bion's technique that became noticeable and fairly common from early on was something with which I was totally unfamiliar at the time and would not previously have thought of as interpretation. This was his calling attention to what I call the splits. He would note that I had talked about A, B, and C, for example, and that each was a different facet of the same experience, viewed from different angles, vertices, or points of view. This helped me move between P, S, and D. The effect was not only acknowledging the discovery of a realization and conception, but of unsaturating the conception so that it was now available as a preconception awaiting the next discovery through another realization. I recall features of a dream which illustrate his calling attention to different vertices. In one part of the dream, I was swimming under water which was cloudy and turbulent, so I could only vaguely make out shapes, color, and motion. In another part, I was situated at a high vista point. The atmosphere was still, and details of the expansive vista were sharp and clear. Bion related this to my bringing together two views of emotional experience regarding some specific event which was evident at the time. I was usually surprised by such interpretations, though they were frequent. I found them so simple and yet integrating and useful. At times when he and I were not clear as to what, specifically and concretely, the different vertices of a dream or association were referring, he would ask for other associations, which often yielded the needed information. He would say that his own questions eliciting associations were also interpretations to call attention to the questions. I recall a particular session, probably within the first year of my analysis, in which he began an interpretation from something I'd said, the link to which was clear at the time. The interpretation was in typical Kleinian part-object language. I was utterly outraged by such a meaningless bunch of jargon. But before I could express outrage and dismay, Bion went on to say something like, "I have no idea whether there is any truth in what I just said, nor what it would mean in more practical and concrete terms. But you may, so I mention it to you in case you have some knowledge of it." I was flabbergasted. The room seemed to literally brighten. I felt a rush of associations which were indeed emotionally alive, along with feelings of amazement, exhilaration, discovery, hope, and so on. I knew this was the way that, in time, one might carry on an ongoing self-analysis. It also emphasized Bion's faith in psychoanalysis and its aesthetic qualities, and his willingness to take a leap, a chance, to use the link we had developed. There were many such instances thereafter. I recall another one that involved my not confirming an interpretation he had made by accessing the emotional experience he was calling to my attention. I was ready to let it go when he said, "It may be the sort of thing you experience with an ant." In a flash, the emotional experience came into my awareness through a memory of just such an experience with an ant. This is another example of his likely using his own psychoanalytic objects to successfully intuit mine. A noteworthy set of experiences occurred on occasions when, not having grasped an interpretation, I would ask if he could repeat it, to be met with his not uncommon response, "It's too late," or "too far by." A related set of remarks would occur when he might ask me what I had meant by some earlier remark, including the comment that it might be too far by for me to say. At first, I was dismayed and bemused by his comments that it was too late to repeat what he had said, and at times I felt he was deliberately withholding. But I now think, and at times even then suspected, that such remarks were due to the evanescent nature of psychoanalytic objects, and especially when he needed access to his psychoanalytic objects in order to make an alive interpretation. Instead of resorting to memory and desire, which are unsuited to psychic reality, he focused on that which can only be observed and described in the moment of its occurrence in the analyst or analysand. A recurring, even fairly frequent feature of Bion's technique was the use of sarcasm, including facetious sarcasm, that sometimes shocked, stunned, frightened, and confused me, and to which I never really acclimated. I did, in time, get tougher and more resilient in response to it. An example would be my commenting on his sounding sarcastic or facetious, and his responding that I was perspicacious, which response also felt sarcastic to me. Was he responding to some sarcasm or aggression in me of which I was unaware? The question is still open. Another innovative class of interpretation, almost entirely new by comparison with what I had learned in my classical American training, was what I refer to as column 6 interpretations. A straightforward example of a column 6 interpretation would be an analysand complaining of chest pain in himself or a loved one, evoking a psychoanalytic object, emotional experience, in the analyst, of the analyst's thoughts about calling an ambulance or getting himself or a loved one to the ER. Such a psychic object in the analyst might result in an interpretation that the analysand may have the idea of calling an ambulance or getting the loved one to the ER. This form of interpretation can easily sound like advice or be construed as advice by the analysand. These interpretations are not advice, but rather call attention to a state of mind enabling the analysand, seemingly oblivious to the possible urgency of the situation, to consider or reject taking an action. The analysand is then presented with an option that was previously unavailable. I'm not certain how often such interpretations are made by more classical Kleinian analysts. I do know interpretations addressing projective identification in A6 with plus or minus LHK links are characteristic of classical interpretation, Kleinian interpretations. One final observation unique to Bion was that being without memory and desire is especially useful in spotting transformations in hallucinosis and unconscious hallucinations resulting from unbearable psychic pain and pathogenic projective identification. The latter produces psychic leaks that can be stopped if the analyst is able to spot them and provide the needed alpha function. If the analysand introjects this capacity, he or she then has an opportunity to grow the needed alpha function, to plug the leak, and develop psychic capacity instead. I hope this description of my personal experience with Bion may help to clarify these aspects in his writings as you come across them in your psychoanalytic sojourn. From Arnaldo Schuster. Finding the right words to describe Jim Gooch is not an easy task. It is even harder because I am in so much mourning for his absence in my life. I could just start describing what a brilliant psychoanalyst he was. However, that part of his life will need a book. I choose to briefly report the privilege of knowing him closer as a member of a Bion study group we were both part of for 20 years. In this group, which began in 2002, I could experience his capacity for grasping the value of a new idea while keeping a deep respect for the unknown. I started appreciating this when I first met him in Buenos Aires in 1999 during the second International Bion meeting. It was amazing how his sensitivity was capable of searching into his most inner emotional experiences and giving strong examples of his psychoanalytic gifts. Those experiences were part of the man, the husband, the father, the friend. In every group, he put his feelings at the disposal of anyone who sought knowledge from him, and he did so with great cheerfulness and generosity. In our last meeting, he proposed to me a task: to build an emotional grid, which I am so far doing my best to accomplish. I will carry with me forever all he gave as a unique and bright friend who always wished the best for everyone.
What I would be willing to say is that Jim had all of his hours with Bion, and then he said Bion was wanting to cut back, and he said, I'm not going to give up any of my hours. I want you to see my wife. And typically Bion didn't ask much about it. He let him know that I'd come from a background in nursing, and that I'd had analysis, a classic analysis. One of my best experiences was with a man who was a graduate of Skippy, but he was also a pediatrician, and I used to drive down to Palos Verdes and have 2 sessions a week before I had any children at all, and that was extremely helpful. The classic analysis, I got tired of analyzing my mom and dad. Then I think I got pregnant with my 3rd child, and so I stopped that classic analysis. And then I remember when Jim was going to go into analysis with Dr. Bion, we had just moved into this house, and we do not, come from any kind of wealth at all. And he'd finished 5 years of 5 times a week with Dr. Bertram Spira, who was a really nice man. Jim says he didn't make me any worse, and that's more than some people could say, so I appreciate him for that. But Jim was a little discouraged with the work and was thinking of going into some other aspect of medicine. So anyway, he came alive with Dr. Bion and was all restored, and then I was to come. And Bion said, have her put it in writing, send me a letter. And so I did, and I think I wrote something that everybody's talking about, Klein and Bion and all these people, and I don't really know much about that, and so I would be interested. I think I told Dr. Bion one time that I have always wanted to do literature, but then I remembered the Bible says there are people who teach when they have need to be taught. I think my dad quoted me that, and I thought that would be me with literature. So I just better do nurses training. I know I'd worked in a doctor's office before, so I knew I could be a nurse. But that was a very demanding experience for me, nurses training. I keep reminding myself that, Freud said the most major important issues in life are birth, serious illness, and death. And that's what you deal with all the time in nursing. And it was a lot for me. But back to Dr. Bion, what then shocked everyone was when Bion saw both of us. And I remember saying, once I had met Dr. Bion, well, maybe most of you couldn't do that. But when I'm in a session with Dr. Bion, it's my session. I remember one of the first interpretations he made to me was, he said, I hear a great deal about what Gooch says. Jim says. Jim says. I hear much less about what you say. So, but I think the interesting thing that came out of my analysis with Dr. Bion was I had a 7-year-old, and I was remembering that he was sent from his home country across the world at that age. And so I kept saying, I can't imagine with my 7-year-old at home how you survived And Dr. Bion said, well, it wasn't my intelligence that saved me. It was rugby. I could play rugby. And I never forgot that, because he was, even when you met him, he was big and tall, you know, and impressive. He was such an interesting man. I remember one time he opened the door and I said, Dr. Bion, there's something unique, there's something special about the way you look out at the world. And he said, perhaps it's the look of an intelligent baby. He absolutely nailed it. That was it. My second son is a gifted intelligence. And that's the way that boy would look out at you. Unflinching, no gaga goo smiles, just a penetrating look. But I just thought that was so unique about him, the way he could just name things. And so it was a very rich experience. And I think, in a way, the maternal transference came through in a very important way.
Could you say more about that?
Yeah, one time, it was my third son. I don't know if you've met him, but it's my only California son. And he was a very physically active kid. He followed his brother, who was the Fulbright scholar. But his strength was physical acumen. He could ski anyone off of Mammoth Mountain from the time he was a little kid. All of our kids skied, actually. Jim Gooch and I were skiing Mammoth Mountain when Jim was 80. He'd go down the mountain, and then one of the little grandkids would go, and I'd ski behind them so nobody would come down on those little toddlers. They all were skiing at 2.5. So we spent a lot of time at Mammoth Mountain, and that was a fun thing we all did together. What did you just ask me?
You were talking about the maternal transference in your 7-year-old.
Oh, yes. So one time I said, well, I'm a little late. I had trouble leaving my 7-year-old. And he said, what was the problem? I said, he just was all upset in one of his tantrums. And I said, we have a full, lovely British carpet, Dr. Bion said about that carpet when I told him, and it's custom made in London, in England. And he said, well, and that's what you needed for an analyst. An ordinary American one wouldn't do. You had to have a British analyst. You know, it was commenting on my good British carpet. But even then, if he's stomping around, it was right over that dining room, and it's where the patients are waiting. So I said, Adam, I've got to go off to my analytic hour. I'll only be gone 45 minutes. Give me 10 minutes to get there, 10 minutes to get back. That's just a little over an hour. And I laid him down on that carpet. I crossed his little arms. I sat on him, and I said, it's time for you to just be the little boy. Let mommy be mommy and daddy be daddy. Your time will come. But right now, I need you to just be a little boy. And Bion was coming. Oh, and then he said, and then what did you do? I said, well, the rocking chair was there, so I picked him up because I could still carry him, and I took him over to the rocker, and he had a cuddly that he'd always liked, a sort of little teddy. So I picked it up, and I said, you know, you can even take a nap. And then by the time you wake up, I'll be back. So I rocked him a bit. I carried him over to the bed. I tucked him in, kissed him, and that's it. He said, you didn't do anything. And I knew he felt I had done a lot. I never forgot the tone of his voice. I said, I didn't do anything, you know. And then he went over what I had done to settle that little one in. So we had our own way of working. And I was always worrying about him. I'd get up and look at him, and I'd say, it's been a long time. You'll have to excuse me. That's the nurse in me. I keep thinking, is he still all right? Because we were young in those days, and you know, he was an old man, but I just came to love him. And
did you stop when he left? Was that what ended it?
Yes, I was there until I knew he was going away, and I knew the analyst from Brazil that was going to go over with him on vacation, and I knew he wanted to go I'm blocking on the country, back to India. He wanted to visit India one more time. I don't think he knew he had a terminal illness. I don't think he knew. Yeah, when he went back.
What was the cancer that he?
Yes, it was a out of control cancer. But you know what's uncanny? Before I started analysis, I had a dream, and I swear it was Merlin at the top of the stairs. So it was that intelligent look. And so when he opened the door, I said, "I had a dream about you last night." And he said, "Really?" He acted more interested than I was. "Yeah," I said, "if you ever need a cartoon, it's Merlin at the top of the stairs." You know, Disney. And I'm probably Mickey sweeping the mess at the bottom. But he said, "Had you ever seen?" I said, "He has the same bushy eyebrows and serious look, but then when the smile comes out, he's transformed." And to me, that was uncanny. He said, "You've never seen a picture?" And I said, "No." Then the day he died, I said to Jim Gooch, "I had the most incredible experience last night. I feel so sad. I feel like," this was my quote, "some important force has gone out of the universe. I haven't felt this way since Daddy died." A few hours later, Jim came back from this very room and he said, "Cheryl, I just heard, I know what's wrong with you. I just heard off the couch Dr. Bion died." Now that deserves Freud's term uncanny.
Sure. Now you didn't even know he was ill at that
No.
point. That must have been quite a blow.
Yeah. And before he left, you know, there were times when we were camping at Leo Carrillo on the beach with all of our kids. I'd get up in the morning and drive in from the beach for an 8 o'clock session with Dr. Bion, and then turn around and I'd get back just as they were all waking up, ready for breakfast. You know, it was just the way of our life. And anyway, the last time I met with him, he started giving me his books, and I did. I kept a whole list of them. I still have them in a box. Sometime we're going to have a place where we can put them. But anyway, he just kept saying, "This may be of interest to you."
Huh.
And he gave all of his Freud. I looked at him. There's not very many marginal notes in Freud at all.
Huh.
He didn't write much, but his fictional works were interesting, the ones that he chose.
Like what?
I can't give you the list. If you want it, I've got it published, but that's been many, many years ago. But it was a whole variety of stories that interested him. And anyway, the last thing he did was he shook my hand and looked me full in the eyes and said, "Continue the adventure." I'll never forget it. Continue the adventure. So enough about me. But Tom,
I've got
more than enough.
Yeah.
And whatever you do,
I really appreciate it, Shirley. And just be aware, this is not enough to really.